The rusted gate creaked open under my trembling hands, and there it was. The ranch that should have been my home for 18 years stretched before me like a forgotten dream. Weathered fence posts lined overgrown pastures, and the two-story farmhouse sat waiting with peeling white paint and dark windows that seemed to watch my approach. I clutched the letter from the lawyer tighter, my knuckles white against the yellowed paper that had changed everything. 20 years I had waited for this moment, 20 years since they took me away from this place, and now I was finally coming home to discover the truth my grandparents had hidden from me all this time. But let me take you back to where this really began, 3 weeks earlier in the cramped office of the Riverside County Children's Services Building. I was sitting across from Mrs. Patterson, my caseworker for the past 4 years, watching her shuffle through my file one last time. At 18, I was officially aging out of the system, and we both knew what that meant. Most kids like me ended up on the streets or bouncing between minimum wage jobs and cheap motels. The statistics weren't encouraging. Alexander, she said, looking up at me with those tired eyes that had seen too many kids like me come and go. I want you to know that you've been one of the success stories. Your grades, your work ethic, the way you've handled every placement. You're going to be okay out there. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Success story, that's what they called kids who didn't end up in juvenile detention or pregnant or addicted to something by their 18th birthday. The bar wasn't set very high in our world. I had managed to graduate high school with decent grades while living in 3 different foster homes over the past 2 years. I had saved up almost $2,000 from my part-time job at the hardware store. By their standards, I was practically ready for Harvard. Quote time, Mrs. Patterson continued, reaching into a manila envelope I hadn't noticed before. This came for you yesterday. It's from a law office in Montana. They said they had been trying to locate you for months. My heart stopped. Nobody had been looking for me since I was 5 years old, when the state took me away from my grandparents' ranch after they died in a car accident. At least, that's what I'd been told. I had no other family, no connections to my past except for a few faded memories of wide open spaces and the smell of hay. The envelope felt heavy in my hands. The return address read, quote, 4. I tore it open with shaking fingers, and the first thing that fell out was a photograph. It showed an elderly man and woman standing in front of a red barn, their arms around each other, smiling at the camera. The man had my eyes. The woman had my stubborn chin. Written on the back in careful cursive were the words, quote, 5, my grandparents. I had seen this photo before, or one very much like it, in the few belongings that had followed me through the system over the years. But this one was different. This one looked recent, not 20 years old like it should have been. The letter itself was typed on official letterwork, signed by someone named Tyler Campbell, attorney at law. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. It began. I looked up at Mrs. Patterson, who was watching me with concern. Stay out of here, quoted. I whispered, quoted 10. I held up the letter with trembling hands. Quote 11. Her face went pale, and she reached for my file, flipping through pages with increasing urgency. Quote, do I say, quote? I asked, holding up the photograph. Quote, before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets even more incredible, and I need to know you're as shocked as I was when I discovered the truth. Mrs. Patterson spent the next hour making phone calls, trying to piece together what had happened. What she discovered made my 18 years of abandonment feel like a cruel joke. My grandfather Nathan had indeed died in 2006, but Dorothy had lived on, running the ranch alone for almost 2 decades. When I was taken into state custody, she had fought for me. She had hired lawyers, filled out paperwork, attended court hearings. But somewhere in the bureaucratic maze of the system, her efforts had been buried under red tape and clerical errors. Quote 15, Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice heavy with guilt. Quote 16, I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. 20 years on a working ranch with my grandmother instead of 20 years bouncing between foster homes and group facilities. 20 years of belonging somewhere instead of 20 years of wondering why nobody wanted me. 20 years of family instead of 20 years of being alone. Quote 17, Mrs. Patterson continued, reading from notes she had scribbled during her phone calls. Quote 18. The irony was devastating. While I was lying awake in foster homes wondering why my family had abandoned me, my grandmother was lying awake on her ranch wondering why the system had stolen her grandson. We had both been victims of the same bureaucratic failure, both mourning a relationship that should have defined our lives. I called Tyler Campbell that afternoon from Mrs. Patterson's office. His voice was warm and sympathetic, tinged with a slight Montana accent that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. He said I asked, surprised by how much I needed to know. Quote 22, Tyler said without hesitation. Quote 23, he explained the details of the inheritance. The ranch was debt-free thanks to Dorothy's careful management and frugal lifestyle. The house was old but well-maintained. The land was prime grazing territory, currently leased to a neighboring rancher who had been helping Dorothy manage the cattle operation. There was even a modest bank account with enough money to cover property taxes and basic expenses for several months. There's something else, Tyler said, his voice growing softer. She left you a letter. She wrote it on her deathbed, hoping that someday it would find its way to you. I think you should read it before you decide what to do with the property. 2 days later, I was on a Greyhound bus heading north through California and into Oregon, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to farmland to mountains. I had never been this far from Los Angeles in my life, and every mile took me further from everything I had ever known. My entire life fit into a single duffel bag on the seat beside me, along with the manila envelope containing the legal documents and Dorothy's final letter, which I hadn't yet found the courage to open. The bus was mostly empty, filled with the kind of people who traveled by Greyhound because they had no other choice. An elderly woman with a shopping bag full of medications, a young mother with 2 small children who cried intermittently throughout the night, a man in work clothes who smelled like cigarettes and kept muttering to himself about a job interview in Portland. I fit right in with this collection of displaced souls, all of us traveling toward uncertain futures. I tried to sleep but couldn't stop thinking about the life I might have had. Instead of learning to survive in group homes, I could have learned to ride horses and fix tractors. Instead of wondering where my next meal was coming from, I could have helped my grandmother tend cattle and grow crops. Instead of aging out of the system with nowhere to go, I could have been preparing to inherit a working ranch and a place in a community that had known me since birth. The anger was overwhelming sometimes. Anger at the caseworker who had written quote 26 in my file without checking the facts. Anger at the system that had failed to reunite a grieving grandmother with her orphaned grandson. Anger at the years of loneliness and instability that could have been avoided with a single phone call or a corrected form. But underneath the anger was something else, something that scared me more than rage ever could. Hope. For the first time in my life, I was traveling towards something instead of away from it. I was going to a place where I belonged, where someone had wanted me, where my name was on a deed and my future was waiting in the form of 847 acres of Montana ranch land. The bus pulled into Willow Creek at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in early April. The town was smaller than I had expected, maybe 3,000 people spread along a main street that looked like something from a movie about small-town America. There was a diner called Martha's Kitchen, a feed store, a bank, a post office, and a handful of other businesses that served the surrounding farming and ranching community. The mountains rose up in the distance, still capped with snow despite the spring warmth in the valley. Tyler Campbell was waiting for me at the bus station, which turned out to be nothing more than a bench in front of the post office. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of tan that came from outdoor work rather than vacation beaches. His handshake was firm and his eyes were kind, in a way that made me think he had never spent a day wondering where he belonged. "Welcome home, Alexander," he said, and the words hit me harder than I had expected. Nobody had ever welcomed me home before. We drove through town in his pickup truck, and I tried to absorb every detail. People waved at Tyler from sidewalks and storefronts, and a few of them stared curiously at me, clearly wondering who the stranger in the passenger seat might be. Tyler pointed out landmarks as we drove. The school where my father had graduated, the church where my grandparents had been married, the cemetery where my grandfather was buried and where Dorothy would be laid to rest in a few days. "She wanted to wait," Tyler explained when I asked about the funeral arrangements. "She made me promise that if I ever found you, we would wait until you could be here for the service. She's been at the funeral home for 3 weeks, waiting for her grandson to come home. The ranch was 5 miles outside of town, down a gravel road that wound between pastures and hayfields. When we crested the final hill, I saw it spread out below us like a picture from a dream I had forgotten I'd ever had. The house was exactly as I remembered it from my 5-year-old memories. A 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and green shutters. The red barn stood behind it, flanked by the smaller outbuildings and corrals. Cattle dotted the pastures, black and red shapes moving slowly across grass that was just beginning to turn green with spring growth. Quote 30, Tyler said, pulling the truck to a stop in front of the house. Quote Aaron. I climbed out of the truck and stood in the gravel driveway, overwhelmed by the silence. After 18 years of group homes and foster families, the quiet was almost deafening. No traffic, no shouting, no television blaring from the next room. Just the sound of wind in the grass and cattle lowing in the distance. The house key felt heavy in my hand as Tyler handed it to me. Quote 32, he said. Quote 33. The front door opened with a creak that triggered a memory so vivid it took my breath away. I was 5 years old again, running through this door after a day of following my grandfather around the ranch, calling for my grandmother to see the frog I had caught by the pond. The smell hit me next, a combination of old wood, lavender, and something else I couldn't identify but recognized in my bones. The living room was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time like a museum exhibit. The same blue couch where my grandmother used to read me stories. The same stone fireplace where my grandfather would build fires on cold evenings. The same family photographs lining the mantelpiece, including several of me as a small child that I had never seen before. But there were new photographs too. Dozens of them scattered on the coffee table and taped to the walls. Pictures of me at various ages, school photos that someone had somehow obtained over the years. My kindergarten picture, my 8th grade graduation, my high school yearbook photo from just a few months ago. Somehow Dorothy had been documenting my life from a distance, collecting images of the grandson she couldn't see. On the kitchen table I found Dorothy's letter, propped against a mason jar filled with wildflowers that had long since dried to brittle stems. My name was written across the envelope in the same careful cursive I had seen on the photograph. I sat down at the table where I had eaten countless childhood meals and opened the letter with trembling fingers. My dearest Alexander, it began, if you are reading this, then God has finally answered my prayers and brought you home where you belong. I don't know how old you are now or what kind of man you have become, but I know that you are good and strong and worthy of all the love I have been saving for you all these years. The letter went on for 3 pages, telling me about the ranch, about the community, about the life she had hoped we would share together. She wrote about the mistakes she had made, the lawyers she had hired, the bureaucrats she had fought in her attempts to find me. She wrote about the dreams she'd had of teaching me to ride and rope and manage cattle, of passing on the knowledge that had been in our family for 3 generations. Quote 36, the letter continued. Quote 7. The final paragraph made me cry for the first time since I was 12 years old. Quote bound, I spent the rest of that first day wandering through the house and outbuildings, rediscovering memories I had buried for 13 years. The barn still smelled like hay and leather and the particular scent of horses, though the stalls were empty now. The workshop behind the house was exactly as my grandfather had left it, tools hanging in neat rows on pegboard walls, a half-finished project still clamped to the workbench. In the attic, I found boxes of family photographs and documents that told the story of 4 generations of Harris ranchers. My great-grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1924, building the original cabin that still stood behind the main house. My grandfather had expanded the operation, adding the barn and outbuildings, increasing the herd size, modernizing the irrigation system. My father had been preparing to take over the ranch when he was killed in a farming accident at age 26, leaving behind a pregnant wife who died in childbirth 2 years later, and a 3-year-old son who would grow up not knowing where he came from. That son was me, and I was finally learning my own history. Tyler returned the next morning with a folder full of legal documents and a man he introduced as Matthew Diaz, the neighboring rancher who had been leasing Dorothy's grazing land. Matthew was in his 50s, weathered and quiet, with the kind of hands that had spent decades working with cattle and machinery. He looked at me with curious eyes, clearly trying to see my grandfather in my face. "You look like Nathan," he said finally, extending a calloused hand for me to shake. "Same build, same way of standing. Dorothy always said you would come back someday." Matthew explained the current arrangement. He had been running his cattle on Dorothy's land for the past 5 years, paying a fair lease rate that had provided Dorothy with steady income in her later years. The arrangement could continue if I wanted, providing me with immediate income while I decided what to do with the property. Or I could terminate the lease and take over the operation myself, though he warned me that ranching was harder than it looked and required knowledge that took years to acquire. Quote 41. I asked, genuinely curious about his opinion. Matthew studied me for a long moment before answering. Quote 042. Quote 40. I said without hesitation, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Quote bar. Matthew nodded approvingly. Quote 45. Tyler handled the legal aspects of the inheritance, walking me through the paperwork and explaining my options. The ranch was mine, free and clear, with no debts or liens. The property taxes were current, and there was enough money in Dorothy's bank account to cover expenses for several months. I could sell the land and walk away with enough money to start a new life anywhere I wanted, or I could stay and learn to be the fourth generation of Harris ranchers. The choice should have been difficult, but it wasn't. For the first time in my life, I was somewhere I belonged. Dorothy's funeral was held 3 days later at the small Methodist church in town. I was amazed by how many people attended, filling the pews and spilling out into the fellowship hall. These were people who had known my grandparents for decades, who had watched my father grow up, who remembered me as a small child before I disappeared into the system. After the service, person after person approached me with stories and condolences. Sarah Chavez, who ran the diner, told me about the meals Dorothy had brought to her family when her husband was injured in a tractor accident. Donald Anderson, who owned the feed store, talked about Dorothy's reputation for honesty and hard work. Nancy Mendoza, the church organist, remembered my grandmother's beautiful singing voice and her dedication to the choir. "Your grandmother was the backbone of this community," said Martha Gray, an elderly woman who had taught my father in elementary school. "She never missed a church supper or a community meeting. When someone was in trouble, Dorothy was the first one there with a casserole and a helping hand. You've got big shoes to fill, young man." The weight of that expectation should have been intimidating, but instead it felt like a challenge I was ready to accept. These people had loved my grandmother, and by extension, they were prepared to accept me as her grandson and heir to her place in the community. After the burial, Matthew invited me to his ranch for dinner with his family. His wife, Michelle, was a warm, practical woman who immediately began planning ways to help me settle into the house. Their teenage daughter was curious about the boy who had grown up in foster care, asking questions that were innocent but cut deep. Their son, who was close to my age, offered to help me learn the practical aspects of ranch work. "It's not easy work," Matthew warned me over Michelle's pot roast. Quote 49. I thought about the alternative. I could sell the ranch and use the money to go to college, maybe become an accountant or a teacher or something safe and predictable. I could move to a city and blend into the anonymity of urban life, where nobody expected anything from me except to pay my bills and stay out of trouble. But I had spent 18 years being nobody from nowhere, and I was tired of it. I wanted to be Alexander Harris, fourth-generation rancher, grandson of Nathan and Dorothy Harris, member of the Willow Creek community. I wanted to have a place where people knew my name and my history and expected me to live up to the legacy I had inherited. Quote 50. I told Matthew. Quote 51. The next few weeks fell into a routine that felt more natural than anything I had ever experienced. I would wake up before dawn and drive over to Matthew's ranch, where I learned to feed cattle, check water tanks, and identify signs of illness or injury in the herd. In the afternoons, I would return to my own property and work on the house and outbuildings, repairing years of minor neglect and making the place livable again. The physical work was harder than anything I had done in foster care, but it was satisfying in a way that surprised me. When I fixed a broken gate or repaired a section of fence, I could see the immediate results of my labor. When I helped Matthew treat a sick calf, I was contributing to something meaningful and necessary. When I fell into bed each night exhausted and sore, I slept better than I had in years. The community began to accept me gradually, testing me in small ways before offering their full trust. Donald Anderson let me help unload feed deliveries at his store, watching to see if I would work hard without complaining. Sarah Chavez offered me free meals at the diner, observing how I interacted with other customers. The local mechanic, a gruff man named Nathan Edwards, agreed to teach me basic equipment repair, evaluating my willingness to learn and my respect for tools and machinery. Each small acceptance felt like a victory. These people had known my family for generations, and they were slowly deciding that I was worthy of the Harris name and the place in their community that came with it. 3 months after arriving in Willow Creek, I faced my first real test as a rancher. Matthew had been gradually transitioning some of his cattle to my pastures, teaching me to manage my own small herd while still maintaining the lease arrangement. I was responsible for about 50 head of cattle, checking them daily, and learning to spot problems before they became serious. On a hot Tuesday morning in July, I discovered that one of the cows had given birth during the night, but something was wrong. The calf was lying motionless in the grass while its mother stood nearby, lowing anxiously. I had seen enough births by then to know that a healthy calf should be on its feet within hours, nursing and following its mother. I called Matthew immediately, but he was 3 hours away at a livestock auction. "You're going to have to handle this yourself," he said over the phone. "The calf is probably weak from a difficult birth. You need to get it up in nursing, or you're going to lose it." My hands were shaking as I approached the cow and calf. The mother was protective but not aggressive, allowing me to get close enough to examine her baby. The calf was breathing but barely responsive, too weak to lift its head. I had watched Matthew handle similar situations, but I had never been solely responsible for saving an animal's life. I managed to get the calf to its feet and guided it to its mother's udder, supporting its weight while it took its first tentative sips of colostrum. For the next 6 hours, I stayed with them, helping the calf nurse every hour and monitoring its condition. By evening, the little bull was standing on his own and nursing without assistance. When Matthew returned that night and found the calf healthy and strong, he nodded approvingly. "You did good, son. That calf would have died without your help. You might just have what it takes to be a rancher after all." The praise meant more to me than any grade I had ever received in school or any compliment from a foster parent. I had saved a life, and in doing so I had proven to myself and to Matthew that I belonged in this world. As summer turned to fall, I began to understand the rhythm of ranch life in a way that felt instinctive. I could read the weather by watching the cattle's behavior and the color of the sky. I could identify sick animals by subtle changes in their posture or eating habits. I could operate and maintain the equipment that kept the ranch running, from tractors to water pumps to the ancient pickup truck that had belonged to my grandfather. The house became truly mine during those months. I painted the exterior, repaired the front porch, and updated the kitchen with modern appliances while preserving the original character that made it home. I hung new photographs alongside the old ones, documenting my new life on the ranch. I planted a garden behind the house, growing vegetables that my grandmother had grown in the same soil. In the evenings, I would sit on the front porch and watch the sunset over my land, still amazed by the silence and space that surrounded me. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, ostensibly to check on the new rancher, but really to see how I was adapting to rural life. These visits became the foundation of friendships that I had never experienced before. Relationships based on mutual respect and shared work rather than the temporary convenience of foster care placements. Tyler Campbell became more than just my lawyer. He became a mentor and friend who helped me navigate the business aspects of ranching. He introduced me to the local banker who had worked with my grandparents for decades, helping me establish credit and plan for future improvements to the ranch. He connected me with other young ranchers in the area, building a network of peers who understood the challenges of carrying on family traditions in a modern world. Quote 55. Tyler told me one evening as we sat on my porch discussing plans to expand the cattle operation. Quote 56. The first winter was hard in ways I hadn't expected. The physical challenges were manageable. I had learned to break ice on water tanks and haul hay to cattle in sub-zero temperatures. But the emotional weight of the season surprised me. The long, dark evenings gave me too much time to think about the years I had lost, the relationship with my grandmother that had been stolen from both of us. I found myself angry again, not just at the system that had failed us, but at the cosmic unfairness of it all. Dorothy had lived for 18 years hoping to see her grandson again, and I had lived for 18 years believing that nobody wanted me. We had both suffered from the same bureaucratic mistake, both mourning a connection that should have sustained us through our separate struggles. But the anger was tempered by gratitude for what I had found. I was no longer the 18-year-old aging out of foster care with nowhere to go and nobody to care whether I succeeded or failed. I was Alexander Harris, owner of the Harris Ranch, member of the Willow Creek community, inheritor of a legacy that stretched back 4 generations. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Matthew and I decided to transition the lease arrangement, giving me full control of my own cattle operation while maintaining our partnership for major decisions and shared equipment. I bought my first herd of cattle with money I had saved from the lease payments and a small loan from the local bank, choosing each animal carefully with Matthew's guidance. The day I drove my own cattle onto my own land for the first time was one of the proudest moments of my life. These weren't animals I was caring for temporarily. They were my responsibility, my investment in the future, my contribution to the ongoing story of the Harris Ranch. I also began to understand my place in the larger community in ways that went beyond ranching. I joined the volunteer fire department, learning to respond to emergencies throughout the county. I became active in the church that my grandparents had attended for decades, finding comfort in the rituals and relationships that had sustained my family for generations. I participated in community meetings and local politics, adding my voice to discussions about land use, water rights, and the economic future of rural Montana. By my 19th birthday, I had been living on the ranch for almost a year, and the transformation in my life was complete. I woke up each morning knowing exactly where I belonged and what I needed to do. I went to sleep each night in the house where my father had been born, surrounded by the land that my great-grandfather had claimed and my grandfather had improved and my grandmother had preserved for me. The boy who had aged out of foster care with nothing but a duffel bag and $2,000 had become a young man with deep roots, meaningful relationships, and a clear purpose. I had learned to read the land and the weather, to care for animals and equipment, to be the kind of neighbor who could be counted on in times of trouble. But more than that, I had learned what it meant to belong somewhere, not just to own property or have a job, but to be part of something larger than myself, something that had existed before I was born and would continue after I was gone. The ranch was thriving under my management. My cattle were healthy and productive. My pastures were well maintained. My equipment was in good repair. I had expanded the operation carefully, reinvesting profits into improvements that would benefit the land for generations to come. I had also begun to explore new opportunities, considering ways to diversify the ranch income through agritourism or specialty beef production. The community had fully accepted me as Dorothy's grandson and Nathan's heir. I was no longer the stranger who had inherited the Harris place. I was Alexander Harris, rancher, neighbor, friend. People came to me for advice about cattle and equipment, invited me to family celebrations, included me in the informal networks of mutual support that kept rural communities functioning. On the first anniversary of Dorothy's death, I organized a memorial service at the ranch, inviting everyone who had known and loved her to share stories and celebrate her life. More than 100 people came, filling the yard between the house and barn, bringing food and flowers and memories that helped me understand the woman who had shaped so much of my life from a distance. Sarah Chavez talked about Dorothy's generosity during hard times, how she had quietly helped struggling families with groceries and utility bills. Donald Anderson remembered her fierce advocacy for local farmers and ranchers, her willingness to challenge government regulations that threatened their livelihoods. Nancy Mendoza sang one of Dorothy's favorite hymns, her voice carrying across the pastures where my grandmother had worked for so many years. Matthew Diaz gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. He said, "As the sun set that evening and the last guest departed, I walked through the pastures where my cattle grazed peacefully in the gathering darkness. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this place, from the bureaucratic mistake that had separated me from my family to the letter that had brought me home to the year of hard work and gradual acceptance that had made me truly belong here. I thought about Dorothy, alone on this ranch for 18 years, maintaining the land and the buildings, and the relationships that would welcome her grandson when he finally returned. I thought about the photographs she had collected, the letters she had written, the faith she had maintained despite every reason to give up hope. I thought about the boy I had been, angry and lost and convinced that nobody wanted him, and the man I had become, rooted in this place and this community in ways that felt as natural as breathing. Standing in the pasture where my great-grandfather had first grazed cattle almost a century ago, I finally understood what Dorothy had tried to tell me in her letter. I wasn't just inheriting property. I was inheriting a place in the world, a role in a story that was bigger than any individual life, a responsibility to preserve something valuable for the next generation. The ranch would continue long after I was gone, just as it had continued through drought and depression, war and recession, the deaths of previous generations, and the mistakes of bureaucrats who had tried to break the chain of inheritance. My children, if I was blessed to have them, would grow up knowing where they came from and where they belonged. They would learn to care for the land and the animals and the community that had sustained our family for 4 generations. Now, 5 years later, as I write this story, the Harris Ranch has become everything Dorothy dreamed it could be. I'm 23 years old, married to a wonderful woman named Michelle Edwards, who grew up on a neighboring ranch, and we're expecting our first child in the spring. The baby will be the 5th generation to call this land home, and I can hardly wait to teach him or her everything my grandfather and Matthew and this community have taught me. The ranch operation has expanded significantly. I now run 300 head of cattle on my own land and lease additional pastures from retired neighbors who trust me to care for their property as well as I care for my own. I've diversified into hay production and custom farming, using my grandfather's old equipment alongside modern machinery that helps me work more efficiently. The ranch generates enough income to support my family comfortably while continuing to improve the land and facilities for future generations. But the real success isn't measured in cattle numbers or bank balances. It's measured in the relationships that have grown from that first tentative acceptance to deep, lasting friendships. It's measured in the knowledge that I have a place in this community that no one can take away, a voice that people listen to, a reputation built on hard work and integrity. I serve on the school board now, helping to ensure that rural children receive the education they need to succeed whether they stay on the family farm or pursue other dreams. I'm active in the Cattlemen's Association, working to protect the interests of ranchers throughout the region. I coach youth baseball in the summer and help with the church youth group, trying to give back to the community that has given me so much. The house has been completely renovated while preserving its historic character. Michelle and I have added modern conveniences and safety features, but the heart of the home remains the same. Dorothy's photographs still line the mantelpiece, now joined by pictures of our wedding and the life we're building together. The kitchen table where I read her letter is still the center of our daily life, where we plan ranch work over morning coffee and welcome neighbors for evening meals. Sometimes I walk through the cemetery where my grandparents are buried, reading the names on weathered headstones and thinking about the generations of families who have called this valley home. I think about the children who grew up here and stayed to carry on family traditions, and the children who left to seek their fortunes elsewhere, but always considered this place their true home. I think about the boy I was, convinced that nobody wanted him, and I wonder how different my story might have been if the system had worked correctly, if Dorothy and I had found each other when I was 5 instead of 18. But I've learned not to dwell on what might have been. The years I spent in foster care taught me resilience and self-reliance that served me well as a rancher. The loneliness I experienced made me appreciate the connections I've found. The uncertainty of my childhood makes me treasure the stability I can provide for my own family. Most importantly, I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or shared genetics. It's about the people who choose to love you, who invest in your success, who stand by you during difficult times. Matthew and Michelle Diaz have been more like parents to me than most of my foster families ever were. Tyler Campbell has been the big brother I never had, celebrating my successes and helping me navigate challenges. The entire Willow Creek community has embraced me as one of their own, proving that belonging is something you earn through your actions, not something you inherit through your birth. I've also learned that legacy isn't just about what you inherit, it's about what you do with what you've been given. Dorothy preserved this ranch for me, But now it's my responsibility to preserve it for the next generation. I'm not just maintaining buildings and pastures. I'm maintaining a way of life, a connection to the land, a commitment to community that becomes more valuable as the world becomes more disconnected and impersonal. The boy who aged out of foster care has become a man with deep roots and clear purpose. I know who I am, where I come from, and where I'm going. I have work that matters, relationships that sustain me, and a future that stretches beyond my own lifetime into the lives of children and grandchildren who will carry on what my great-grandfather started almost a century ago. Every morning when I step onto my front porch and look out over the pastures where my cattle graze, I think about Dorothy's letter and the faith she maintained despite 18 years of separation. She believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that family bonds were stronger than bureaucratic failures, that someday her grandson would come home where he belonged. She was right about all of it. If you're watching this and you've experienced foster care, adoption, or family separation, I want you to know that your story isn't over. The family that raised you might not be the family you were born to, but that doesn't make the love any less real or the connections any less meaningful. Home isn't always the place you started. Sometimes it's the place you choose, the place that chooses you back, the place where you finally understand who you were meant to become. If you're dealing with bureaucratic systems that seem designed to keep families apart rather than bring them together, don't give up hope. Keep fighting, keep asking questions, keep believing that the truth will eventually surface. Dorothy spent 18 years fighting a system that had made a mistake, and she never stopped believing that love would find a way. If you're part of a community like Willow Creek, remember the power you have to welcome strangers, to give second chances, to help people find their place in the world. The acceptance I found here literally saved my life, giving me purpose and belonging when I had neither. Every small town, every neighborhood, every workplace has the opportunity to be that kind of healing place for someone who needs it. And if you're someone who has inherited something valuable, whether it's property or traditions or simply the love of people who came before you, remember that inheritance comes with responsibility. You're not just receiving a gift, you're becoming a steward of something that belongs to future generations as much as it belongs to you. I want to thank everyone who has watched this story and shared it with others. Your comments and messages have meant more to me than you know. Please subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story has meant to you. Share your own experiences with family, belonging, and finding your place in the world. We're all part of the same human story, all searching for the same things, all capable of creating the kind of community that welcomes people home. The Harris Ranch will continue for generations to come, but more than that, the values it represents will continue. Hard work, integrity, community, family, faith, and the belief that everyone deserves a place where they belong. These are the things that Dorothy preserved for me, and these are the things I'll preserve for my children. Sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's simply the knowledge that you are loved, that you belong somewhere, that your life has meaning and purpose. Sometimes coming home isn't about returning to where you started. It's about finding where you were always meant to be. That's what happened to me on 847 acres of Montana ranch land. And that's what can happen to anyone who refuses to give up on the possibility that somewhere in this world, there's a place where they belong.